a metallic snarl that shredded the silence of the elite Seoul Academy. Grace lunged, her emerald blazer ablur as she tackled the trembling Chanwoo song, their bodies colliding with the floor just as the locker bank disintegrated into a roar of orange fury and flying shrapnel. 1 second, a quiet hallway. The next, a jagged hellscape of choking drywall dust and the rhythmic, terrifying thump of heavy tactical boots. Grace pinned the boy beneath her lithe frame, her eyes stinging from the soot while the smoke curled into thick, gray serpents around them. Through the haze, 3 silhouettes emerged, men in matte black gear, their suppressed rifles raised like scythes as they stepped over the burning debris toward the 2 survivors. Grace didn't pray. She coiled, her fingers closing around a jagged shard of glass, her gaze locking onto the lead assassin's shadow as the red laser dot of a sniper's sight danced across the rubble, hunting for the boy's heart. Where are you listening from tonight? Drop your location and your wildest theory for the ending below in the comment section. Don't just watch the story, join the syndicate. Hit like, subscribe to the channel Dominus Tailies, and let's get back to the chaos. The red laser dot vanished as a heavy shadow eclipsed the sun streaming through the shattered skylight. The 3 assassins froze, then retreated into the gray haze as the sound of a dozen black SUVs screeched to a halt outside. The heavy tactical boots were replaced by the rhythmic, terrifying click of Italian leather on glass. Hakjun Song stepped over a dead gunman, his midnight black suit unblemished by the falling ash. He didn't look at the fire, he looked at Grace. Grace didn't move, her body still shielding the shivering Chanwoo as she gripped the glass shard tighter. Hakjun came to a halt 3 feet away, his obsidian eyes scanning the soot on her cheek and the emerald fabric of her torn blazer. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a thank you. Who told you to touch him? His voice was a low, vibrating blade. Grace stood up, pulling Chanwoo with her, her gaze level with the man the underworld called the Dragon. The bomb told me, she snapped back, her voice steady despite the adrenaline vibrating in her marrow. Hakjun's eyes flickered to his son, who was clutching Grace's arm like a lifeline, his pale face buried in her shoulder. The dragon's temple pulsed. He leaned in, his shadow swallowing them both. You aren't a teacher, he whispered, his eyes dissecting her athletic stance and the way she balanced her weight. Teachers scream, teachers run, you hunted that threat. Grace didn't blink. I protected my student. Hakjun turned his back, a signal to the wall of armed men now filling the hallway. You saved the heir to the Song Empire, he said, his voice echoing against the charred walls. That is a debt I cannot leave in the hands of a stranger. He turned his head just enough for his profile to catch the light. The men who did this are still outside. They know your face. They know your name. If you stay here, you die within the hour. Grace felt the cold realization sink in, but before she could speak, 2 of Hakjun's men stepped behind her, their presence a silent, immovable wall. You're coming with us, Hakjun commanded. It wasn't an invitation. Chanwoo's grip on her camisole tightened, his knuckles white. She stays with me, the boy whispered, his first words since the blast, his voice cracked but desperate. Hakjun's expression remained carved from granite, but his eyes narrowed at the bond between them. Then she is part of the detail now. Before Grace could protest, she was being swept toward the exit, the smell of ozone replaced by the scent of expensive cologne and gasoline. They reached the curb where a convoy of armored vehicles waited, engines idling like growling beasts. Hakjun opened the door of the lead car himself, his eyes locking onto Grace, with a dark, suffocating gravity. You saved his life, Grace. Now you'll help me keep it, or you'll be buried next to the people who failed today. He didn't wait for her consent. He simply gestured inside. The door slammed shut, the locks clicking with finality, and the city of Seoul began to blur past the tinted windows as the dragon claimed his prize. 6,000 miles away, the rain in London didn't wash away the filth. It only made the marble glow with a deceptive, cold purity. Inside a private Mayfair gallery, the air was silent, scented with expensive jasmine and the sterile musk of ancient oil paintings. Jinho Kang stood before a canvas of a falling angel, his tailored gray suit fitting his lean frame like a second skin. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a masterpiece of refinement, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of a crystal flute filled with vintage Krug. The silence shattered when a phone vibrated on a mahogany pedestal, the haptic buzz sounding like a death rattle in the cavernous room. His lead strategist approached, footsteps muffled by the velvet rugs, his face a mask of sweating terror. "The Seoul Initiative," the man stammered, holding out a tablet displaying the charred remains of the academy. "It failed. The boy is alive. A woman, a teacher, she moved before the trigger could fully cycle." Jinho didn't flinch. He didn't shatter the glass or roar at the ceiling. Instead, he took a slow, methodical sip of the champagne, his eyes never leaving the falling angel on the wall. A thin, elegant smile spread across his lips, a predator's curve that never reached his freezing eyes. "My brother always did like a hero," he whispered, his voice a smooth, terrifying silk that seemed to chill the room's temperature. "Hakjun plays the lion, so he surrounds himself with those who have teeth. He thinks a teacher's heart is a shield, but I see it as a tether." Jinho turned away from the art, his mind already moving 3 moves ahead on a board spanning continents. He tapped a command into the tablet with a manicured thumb, bypassing 3 layers of encrypted firewalls. The screen flickered with a high-resolution image of Grace, soot-stained, defiant, and clutching the Mafia prince in the rubble. "She is the variable he didn't calculate, and now she is the only reason he feels safe," Jinho murmured, his reflection in the gallery glass looking sharper than a scalpel. He pulled up a dark web terminal, the interface glowing neon green against the dim light of the London afternoon. With a single keystroke, he authorized a transfer of $50 million into a blind escrow account. "Post the bounty," he commanded, his voice devoid of heat. "I want the dragon's debt paid in full. Tell the syndicates in Europe, the cartels in the West, and the hunters in the South that the boy is a bonus, but I want the woman alive. I want to see exactly what kind of soul is brave enough to stand between me and my inheritance." He watched the notification ping across the global underworld, a digital virus of greed. The London rain lashed against the windows, but inside, Jinho Kang was already basking in the heat of a world about to burn. The armored convoy screamed through the neon-soaked arteries of Gangnam, tires screeching against wet asphalt as the rain turned the city into a blurred kaleidoscope of electric blue and blood red. Inside the lead SUV, the air was thick with the scent of Chanwoo's panic and the cold, vibrating silence of Hakjun's fury. Suddenly, the windshield disintegrated in a hail of high-caliber rounds. The driver's head snapped back, his life extinguished in a spray of crimson that painted the dashboard. The heavy vehicle swerved violently toward a concrete pylon, but Grace moved like a coiled spring, her hands blurring as she grabbed the steering wheel from the backseat and forced the 2-ton beast into a controlled skid. "Get out! Now!" she roared over the thunder of gunfire. They ditched the smoking wreck just as a secondary explosion rocked the street, leaping onto a customized, matte black Ducati parked in the shadows of an alleyway. Hakjun didn't hesitate. He shoved Chanwoo between them, but as he reached for the handlebars, a bullet grazed his shoulder, his arm going limp. Grace didn't ask for permission. She kicked the engine to life, the roar of the 1,200cc motor drowning out the chaos. She slammed the bike into gear, her emerald blazer fluttering like a battle flag as they tore out of the alley and into the blinding rain. 2 modified sports cars pursued them, their headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of hungry wolves. Grace leaned into the curves, her knees hugging the tank as she wove through gridlock traffic at 100 miles per hour. She didn't see a teacher in the rearview mirror. She saw a predator reclaiming her territory. Bullets whizzed past her helmet, sparking off the metal railings of the Mapo Bridge. "Hold on!" she yelled, downshifting and popping the clutch to loft the front wheel over a fallen barricade. She banked the bike so low the foot pegs threw sparks against the flooded pavement, narrow milling between 2 moving buses with inches to spare. The pursuing cars collided in a spectacular wreck behind them, a fireball blooming in the rainy dark. Grace didn't look back. She pushed the Ducati to its absolute limit, the speedometer climbing until the world became a streak of white light. They cleared the city limits, screaming onto a restricted access road that led toward the private sector of Incheon. A massive steel hangar loomed out of the fog, its doors yawning open like the mouth of a waiting giant. Grace skidded the bike to a halt inside the sterile, halogen-lit interior, the tires smoking despite the rain. She killed the engine, the silence that followed more deafening than the chase. Hakjun climbed off, clutching his bleeding arm, his obsidian eyes fixed on Grace with a newfound, terrifying respect. A private jet's engines began to whine in the background, the scent of aviation fuel filling the air. They weren't just leaving the city, They were leaving the world they knew behind. The jet touched down in Geneva under a sky the color of a bruised lung, the air biting and clinical as they moved toward the heart of the Swiss banking district. The private vault was a fortress of brushed steel and frosted glass, tucked deep beneath a cobblestone street that felt like a relic of a colder century. Inside, the temperature dropped, the silence so heavy it felt pressurized against Grace's eardrums. Hakjun moved through the lobby with a predator's grace, his arm in a sling but his eyes sharper than a scalpel. They were here for the black box, a ghost account containing the digital keys to the Song Empire's global infrastructure. The bank manager, a man with skin like parchment and eyes that refused to blink, led them into a high-security sanctum bathed in a pale, sterile blue light. "The biometric scan requires the heir," the manager whispered, his voice echoing in the metallic void. Chanwoo stepped forward, his hands still trembling as he placed his palm on the scanning plate. Suddenly, the blue light turned a violent, pulsing crimson. The heavy steel doors hissed shut, the magnetic locks engaging with a sound like a guillotine. Grace's warrior instinct flared. She scanned the room, noticing the security cameras articulating with a smoothness that wasn't standard. They were being remote-controlled. A wall-mounted monitor flickered to life, revealing the elegant, terrifying face of Jinho Kang. He sat in his London gallery, swirling a glass of wine, his smile appearing on the screen like a digital scar. "Geneva is beautiful this time of year, isn't it, brother?" Jinho's voice purred through the vault speakers, distorted and mocking. "But you forgot one thing: money doesn't have loyalty, it only has a price. And I've just bought this bank." The ceiling vents hissed, releasing a faint, sweet-smelling gas. At the same moment, the frosted glass partitions shattered as 4 automated sentry turrets rose from the floor, their barrels spinning with a lethal hum. This wasn't a bank anymore. It was a kill box designed by a genius. "Get down!" Grace screamed, grabbing Chanwoo by his designer collar and hurling him behind a reinforced titanium desk just as the first volley of lead shredded the manager into a cloud of red mist. Hakjun pulled a concealed subcompact from his waistband, returning fire with clinical precision, but the turrets were armored and unrelenting. The air became a storm of flying sparks and pulverized marble. Grace realized they were trapped in a steel tomb, and Jinho was watching the execution in high definition. She looked at the terminal. The only way out was to override the system from the inside, but to do it, she'd have to expose herself to the crossfire. The hunt wasn't coming for them. It was already here, and the clock in the corner of the screen was counting down to 0. The private jet banked over the Mediterranean, the cabin bathed in the flickering orange of a dying sunset, but the atmosphere inside remained sub-zero. Grace sat across from Hakjun, her knuckles still stained with the carbon score of the Geneva firefight, her eyes tracking every muscle in his face. In the back, Chanwoo lay curled on a leather sofa, his breathing ragged and shallow as he slipped into a fitful, trauma-induced sleep. The silence was a physical weight, broken only by the low hum of the engines and the rhythmic clicking of Hakjun's lighter. "He's not a soldier, Hakjun." Grace's voice cut through the air like a serrated blade, low enough to keep the boy asleep but sharp enough to draw blood. The Mafia boss didn't move, his profile remaining a rigid mask of stone as he stared out into the black abyss of the clouds. "He is my son," he countered, the words dry and hollow. Grace leaned forward, her emerald blazer rumpled but her presence more commanding than the man with the empire. "He's a ghost in an ivory sweater. You've built a world of titanium and shadows, but you forgot to give him a floor to stand on." Hakjun's jaw tightened, a single vein at his temple throbbing under the cabin's dim LED lights. "Safety requires sacrifice, teacher. My enemies do not negotiate with childhood." Grace scoffed, a bitter, jagged sound. "You call this safety?" "He's 19 and his eyes look like they've seen the end of the world. You're not protecting him, you're burying him alive in your own legacy." For the first time, the granite man turned, his obsidian eyes clashing with hers in a silent, violent collision of wills. He looked ready to strike, but then his gaze drifted past her shoulder to the small, shivering figure of his son. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. Grace watched as the absolute stillness of his posture collapsed, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch as he watched Chanwoo let out a soft, whimpering moan in his sleep. Hakjun reached out, his hand hovering over the boy's forehead, trembling with a humanity he had spent decades trying to kill. He didn't touch him, afraid his own darkness might burn the boy, but the raw, naked agony in his expression was a confession. "I don't know how to be the father he needs and the commander they fear," he whispered, the admission a tectonic shift in the room. Grace felt her own defenses soften, the warrior's instinct giving way to a shared, heavy burden. She reached across the aisle, her hand momentarily covering his steadying grip on the armrest. "Start by letting him be a person, not a target," she said softly. In that high-altitude silence, the teacher and the tyrant found a common language. The war was still coming, but for 1 minute, they weren't assets and protectors. They were two people desperately trying to keep a flickering light from going out in the dark. The satellite phone hissed with static before a voice as smooth as aged whiskey filled the pressurized cabin. "Do you remember the winter of '96, brother?" Jinho's voice arrived like a ghost from a shallow grave, dripping with a nostalgia that felt like a threat. Hakjun's grip on the handset turned his knuckles white as a jagged memory surfaced. A sprawling, snow-covered estate in Seoul, where a 10-year-old Hakjun sat at the head of a banquet table, while a younger Jinho stood outside in the freezing dark, his face pressed against the glass. He was the ghost, the illegitimate stain on the Song bloodline, born to a mother whose name was never whispered in the halls of power. "You were the golden sun, draped in silk and destiny," Jinho continued, his tone devoid of heat but heavy with the weight of 30 years of resentment. "Our father gave you the crown and gave me a ticket to London with instructions to disappear. But ghosts don't disappear, Hakjun. We just wait for the lights to go out." Hakjun's voice was a low, dangerous growl. "You were given a life most men would kill for, Jinho. You chose to turn it into a graveyard." A soft, chilling laugh echoed through the line. "I didn't choose the graveyard, I inherited it. Every brick of your empire is built on the bones of the things I was denied. You think you're protecting the heir, but you're just guarding a relic of a dying era." Grace watched Hakjun's face turn a sickly shade of gray as the psychological warfare intensified. Then, the tone shifted. Jinho's voice dropped an octave, becoming intimate and predatory. "And what about your new shadow, Grace? Such a beautiful, capable warrior. I wonder if she knows that her bravery has a geographic limit." A digital ping sounded on the jet's navigation console. An image flickered onto the screen, a grainy, high-angle surveillance shot of a vibrant, sun-baked market in Lagos, Nigeria. The camera zoomed in on an elderly woman and a young girl laughing near a fruit stall. Grace's heart stopped. "Family is the ultimate leverage, isn't it?" Jinho whispered, the sound of a London rainstorm audible in his background. "You've spent so much time hiding in the cold of Europe, but your teacher's roots are planted in much warmer soil. My men are already enjoying the heat in Lagos. They tell me the hospitality is explosive." Grace lunged for the phone, her eyes burning with a primal maternal fury that surpassed any Mafia loyalty. "If you touch them," she choked out, her voice a promise of slaughter. "Oh, I won't touch them yet," Jinho purred. "I just wanted to make sure we're all playing for the same stakes. See you in the motherland, brother. Don't be late for the reunion." The line went dead, leaving nothing but the roar of the engines and the terrifying realization that the war had just moved to Grace's doorstep. The jet tore through the stratosphere, a silver needle stitching together two worlds as the sterile blues of Geneva dissolved into the fiery, unapologetic gold of the African horizon. Grace stood in the cockpit, her jaw set like iron as the pilot banked over the sprawling, chaotic masterpiece of Lagos. Below them, the city breathed, a massive, undulating beast of corrugated zinc roofs, emerald green palms, and the shimmering, oil-slicked arteries of the lagoon. "We don't land at the international airport," Grace commanded, her voice cutting through the cockpit's hum with a local's authority. "Jinho owns the customs officers there. We drop at a private strip in Lekki." Hakjun watched her from the cabin doorway, his midnight suit looking like a bruise against the vibrant light flooding the windows. As the wheels hit the sun-baked tarmac, the heat hit them like a physical blow, a thick, humid embrace smelling of salt spray, diesel, and roasted maize. The silence of Europe was dead. In its place was a beautiful, deafening roar. They stepped off the plane into a world of high-contrast saturation. The dust was a rich, ochre orange that clung to Hakjun's polished shoes, and the vegetation was so aggressively green it felt alive. Grace didn't wait for the armored SUVs. She signaled to a fleet of battered, yellow Danfo buses and gleaming black motorcycles weaving through the gridlock. "In this city, "The shadows don't hide you," she shouted over the cacophony of blaring horns and street vendors. "The noise does." They moved through the heart of the mainland, a sensory overload of neon-painted stalls, towering skyscrapers, and the rhythmic, bass-heavy pulse of Afrobeats leaking from every corner. Chanwoo stared out the window, his glazed, thousand-yard stare finally cracking as the sheer, frantic energy of the streets forced him back into the present. This wasn't a clinical kill box. It was a labyrinth of 10 million souls where every alleyway was a shortcut and every face was a story. Grace navigated the chaos with a kinetic grace, her eyes scanning the rooftops for the glint of Jinho's snipers while simultaneously greeting the locals in sharp, melodic Yoruba. She was home, and the predator within her was finding its rhythm in the heat. Hakjun sat low in the seat, his hand hovering over his weapon, realizing that here, his name held no weight, and his money was just paper. The power dynamic had shifted. As the sun began to dip, turning the sky into a bruised purple and electric orange, Grace led them deeper into the vibrant maze of the city. They weren't just running anymore. They were disappearing into the beautiful, dangerous heart of the motherland, where the rules of the Korean underworld were about to be rewritten in the red dust of Lagos. The yellow Danfo bus swerved into the heart of a quiet, tree-lined residential enclave, the roar of the Lagos expressway fatting into the rhythmic chirping of hidden cicadas. They pulled up before a towering, wrought-iron gate draped in bougainvillea, a structure that breathed with the weight of generations. This was Grace's ancestral sanctuary, a sprawling colonial-style house with wide verandas and walls that had absorbed a century of secrets. As the gates groaned open, a tall, regal woman with hair like a silver crown stepped onto the porch, her arms folded across a vibrant Ankara wax-print dress. This was Grace's aunt, Teniola, a woman whose gaze held more authority than any crime lord Grace had ever encountered. Grace jumped from the bus, the warrior's tension in her shoulders finally snapping as she was pulled into a crushing, spice-scented embrace. Hakjun and Chanwoo stepped out, looking like alien visitors in their dark, tailored suits against the lush, sun-drenched greenery. Hakjun reached for his waistband, his instinct to secure the perimeter flaring, but Teniola's eyes locked onto him with the force of a tidal wave. "Not in this house, young man," she commanded, her voice a deep, melodic bronze that brooked no argument. "The only power that rules here is family, and family does not carry iron at the dinner table." Hakjun, the man who commanded thousands in Seoul, found himself slowly lowering his hand, silenced by a dignity he couldn't buy. Inside, the air smelled of slow-roasted jollof rice, fried plantains, and the earthy scent of rain on hot stone. Grace's younger cousins swarmed the living room, their laughter a chaotic, beautiful contrast to the sterile silence of the Song Empire. They didn't see a Mafia prince in Chanwoo. They saw a tired boy who looked like he needed a plate of food and a reason to smile. Within an hour, the thousand-yard stare in Chanwoo's eyes began to melt as he sat on a low wooden stool, clumsily trying to learn a local hand-clapping game from a 10-year-old girl. For the first time in his life, he wasn't a target or an heir. He was just a guest. Grace watched from the kitchen doorway, her eyes misting as she saw Hakjun sitting awkwardly on a velvet sofa, being lectured by Teniola about the proper way to drink palm wine. The granite man looked bewildered, stripped of his dragon persona by a woman who treated him like a wayward nephew. It was a brief, shimmering moment of real life, a pocket of warmth in a world of cold steel. But as the ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, casting rhythmic shadows across the family photos on the wall, Grace caught the flicker of a red light on a distant palm frond. The sanctuary was perfect, but the world outside was still hungry. The peace was a beautiful lie, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the warmth of the hearth couldn't hide the chill of the coming storm. The peace of the sanctuary shattered with the arrival of a single, pristine white limousine, cutting through the red dust of the neighborhood like a surgical blade. Jinho Kang didn't come with the thunder of helicopters or a legion of gunmen. He arrived with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of a virus. He stepped out under the scorching Lagos sun, his light gray linen suit looking impossibly cool, his eyes shielded by dark lenses that reflected the vibrant chaos around him like a mockery. Within minutes of his arrival, the street was flooded not by assassins, but by the local police force, black and gold uniforms swarming the gates, sirens wailing in a discordant symphony that drowned out the cicadas. Jinho hadn't bought their loyalty with bullets. He had bought the narrative with a masterful web of deceit. He stood at the perimeter, flanked by a high-ranking commissioner he had compromised months in advance, holding a dossier of falsified international warrants. "It's a tragedy, really," Jinho's voice drifted over the garden wall, amplified by a megaphone, sounding like a smooth, toxic honey. "A kidnapping of a Korean national by a radicalized local teacher and a disgraced criminal fugitive. I'm only here to facilitate a peaceful return." Grace stood on the veranda, her heart hammering against her ribs as she saw the community she loved being turned into a staging ground for a psychological massacre. Her neighbors, people who had known her since childhood, looked on with growing suspicion as the local news vans, tipped off by Jinho's London PR team, began to broadcast the rescue live. This wasn't a battle of firepower, it was a battle of optics. Jinho looked directly at the security camera Grace had installed, a slow, predatory smirk spreading across his face. "You have 60 minutes, brother," he purred into the phone, the call patching directly into the house's intercom. "If the boy doesn't walk out, the authorities will enter to liberate him. And in the confusion of a raid, accidents happen, fire spreads, families disappear." Hakjun stood in the darkened living room, his hands trembling with a rage he couldn't unleash. If he fired a single shot, he would confirm every lie Jinho had whispered. The dragon was trapped in a glass cage of his brother's making. Every move was a checkmate. Grace watched Jinho casually check his watch, the sheer cunning of his play making her blood run cold. He was poisoning the very soil she stood on, turning her sanctuary into a prison by simply telling a better story. The tension wasn't in the trigger fingers. It was in the suffocating realization that the truth was the first casualty of the Song family war. As the countdown began, the vibrant energy of Lagos felt like it was being sucked into a vacuum, leaving only the cold, calculating eyes of the Serpent watching his prey through the bars. The standoff didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened in the belly of a massive, abandoned red clay quarry on the outskirts of Lagos, where the earth looked like an open wound under the brutal midday sun. The air was a thick, suffocating haze of ochre dust and diesel fumes as Jinho's mercenaries formed a lethal perimeter around the pit's jagged floor. Grace stood at the center, a jagged obsidian blade pressed against her throat by Jinho's lead enforcer, her emerald blazer now a tattered rag against the crimson dirt. Hakjun and Chanwoo were cornered against a wall of unyielding rock, the dragon's midnight suit caked in the dust of the motherland. Jinho stepped forward, his linen suit still impossibly white, a contrast so sharp it hurt the eyes. "This was never about a crown, Hakjun," Jinho's voice echoed off the clay walls, stripped of its London refinement and replaced by a raw, jagged edge. "The Empire is a corpse. I've spent the last decade shorting your stocks, subverting your generals, and bleeding your accounts dry. My grand scheme wasn't to take your seat, it was to erase your history." He gestured to the sky, where a high-altitude drone hummed like a vengeful insect. "Today, the world sees the great Hakjun song perish in a tragic foreign kidnapping. I inherit the ruins, clean the blood, and start a new dynasty without your shadow." He pulled a gold-plated revolver from his waistband and pointed it squarely at Chanwoo's chest, the movement fluid and devoid of hesitation. "But first, the choice," Jinho purred, his eyes dancing with a manic, flickering light. "You have a digital key, brother. One encrypted drive that unlocks the final offshore reserves, the core of the Song legacy. Drop the drive and I let the teacher go. Keep it and I finish the bloodline right here in the dirt." Grace looked at Hakjun, her eyes screaming for him to hold his ground, but the granite man was crumbling. He looked at the drive in his hand, the power of 10,000 men, and then at the trembling, pale boy beside him. The stakes weren't just life or death, they were the past versus the future. "The Empire is nothing without the boy," Hakjun whispered, his voice breaking as the red dust swirled around his feet. He stepped forward, the drive glinting in the sun like a diamond. Jinho's smile widened, a terrifying mask of triumph. "Choose, dragon, the gold or the ghost." The silence in the quarry was absolute, the tension a physical cord stretched to the breaking point. Hakjun's hand hovered over the abyss, the weight of a 1,000-year legacy balanced against the life of a son who had finally learned to breathe. The wind howled through the red clay, carrying the scent of blood and the terrifying finality of a choice that could never be undone. The drive hit the red dust with a hollow thud, a king's ransom surrendered for a son's life. Jinho's laughter was a jagged, triumphant sound that sliced through the heat of the quarry. "The dragon is dead," he mocked, gesturing for his man to retrieve the drive. But then the air shifted. The trembling in Chanwoo's hands didn't just stop. It vanished into a terrifying, absolute stillness. The boy stood up, brushing the ochre dust from his ivory sweater with a clinical, chilling calm. He didn't look like a victim anymore. He looked like a god of the machine. "You always were a sentimental fool, father." Chanwoo's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a cold, melodic hum that froze the blood in Grace's veins. He pulled a slim, customized tablet from the hidden lining of his joggers, the screen glowing with a rapid-fire sequence of code that mirrored the obsidian depth of his eyes. "And you, uncle," he said, turning to Jinho with a ghost of a smirk, "you were so blinded by your own revenge that you forgot who actually builds the firewalls." The twist hit the quarry like a secondary explosion. Chanwoo hadn't been a pawn, he was the grandmaster. "The school bomb, that was me," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "I needed to flush you out of London and strip my father of his pride. I leaked our location at every turn, the airport, Geneva, the sanctuary, all to bring you both here together at the edge of the world." Grace felt the enforcer's grip slacken in sheer shock as the reality set in. The shattered boy had been the architect of his own trauma to achieve total control. "I didn't just hide on the flight, uncle. I lived inside your servers," Chanwoo continued, his thumb hovering over a final execution command. "While you were playing at war, I was liquidating your London assets and rerouting your escrow accounts into a blind trust in my name. You don't have a bounty out on us anymore. You don't even have a bank account." Jinho's face drained of color, his linen suit suddenly looking like a shroud. The drone above didn't fire on Hakjun. It suddenly pivoted, its laser sights locking onto Jinho's chest. "I'm not the heir to an empire," Chanwoo whispered, the blue light of the tablet reflecting in his glazed, almond eyes. "I am the empire." With a single, rhythmic tap, he executed the final protocol. The mercenaries' phones chimed simultaneously, a notification that their contracts had been overwritten by a higher bidder. The hunters turned their weapons on the man who had hired them. Grace watched in horror as the boy she had bled to protect revealed himself as a monster more efficient than the ones he replaced. The red dust swirled as the power dynamic disintegrated, leaving the dragon and the serpent standing in the shadow of a 19-year-old boy who had just cold-bloodedly conquered them both. The red dust settled over the quarry like a shroud of rust, the silence following Chanwoo's digital execution more violent than any gunshot. Jinho Kang didn't die. He simply ceased to exist in the world of the powerful, his phone screen flashing a cold, hollow zero as his global identity was systematically deleted by the nephew he had underestimated. He collapsed into the ochre dirt, a broken masterpiece in a ruined linen suit, stripped of his name, his billions, and his pride while his own mercenaries vanished into the Nigerian heat, following the scent of Chanwoo's superior coin. Hakjun's song stood frozen, his obsidian eyes fixed on his son with a terrifying, soul-deep realization that chilled the African air. He had spent years fearing his son was too fragile for the Song bloodline, but as he watched Chanwoo pocket the tablet with a predatory, effortless grace, he realized the boy wasn't a victim of the legacy. He was its ultimate, most lethal evolution. The granite man saw a mirror in the boy's cold, glazed gaze, a reflection of a monster more calculated and devoid of mercy than he had ever dared to be. Grace stepped away from the wreckage, the iron-scented air filling her lungs as she looked at the two men, the father who had transitioned into a ghost and the son who had become a god. She didn't ask for a reward. She didn't need to. A notification chimed on her own phone, a silent deposit from a shadow account that ensured her school and her family would never know Juan again, a parting gift from the wolf she had raised in her classroom. She turned her back on the quarry, walking through the red haze toward the vibrant, pulsing heart of Lagos without a single backward glance. The calm in the storm had weathered the hurricane, but she was no longer the woman who had thrown a backpack out of a window in Seoul. Months later, the light in a quiet classroom in the motherland caught the edge of an emerald green blazer. Grace stood before a new sea of faces, her posture remarkably grounded, her presence radiating a dark, suffocating gravity that commanded the room. She wasn't just a teacher anymore. She was a guardian who had seen the gears of the world turn and had greased them with her own blood. As she picked up a piece of chalk, her eyes didn't just scan the room for trouble. They looked through the walls, through the city, and into the shadows. She knew exactly what lay in the dark, and for the first time, the darkness was the one that should be afraid. The final bell rang, a sharp, metallic sound, and Grace smiled, a slow, knowing curve that held the weight of 3 continents and 1,000 secrets. Breathless? Good. You just survived another hit from Dominus tailies, but in this underworld, the faces change as fast as the bullets. Every time we drop, we open a new file on a fresh kingpin, a new betrayal, and a different war. This vault of cinematic chaos stays open only because of you. Don't watch from the sidelines. Join the inner circle by hitting subscribe and smashing that like button to keep our engines running. Drop your theories below on who surfaces next. The story doesn't end when the screen goes black. It ends when you stop watching. See you in the next shadows.